why will all cultures be influenced by a mainstream culture? The mainstream culture is the one that controls cultural standards worldwide. It is the most flexible and therefore widely accepted throughout communities. So you might find H&M and Louis Vuitton stores in China, fast food restaurants in Greece, or even Beyonce streaming in the streets of Dubai. But that doesn't mean that one has to change their standards as to abide by the mainstream culture. So for all the Japanese lovers out there, don't worry, you will still be eating sushi for a very long time, not only hamburgers. This is because important subcultures will not cease to exist. The smaller cultures, however, might die out eventually, and maybe that's why no one talks about Bigfoot anymore. So we can picture this as a solar system, where the mainstream culture can be seen as the sun and the subcultures as the moons, planets, and satellites. But to understand the effects of cultural fusion, how did culture first arise in humanity? Every human is distinct. Everyone thinks differently. Nonetheless, we can effectively work with a huge corporation of humans we have never seen before in our entire lives. How do we build that type of trust? We convince people to think like we do, resulting in a common interest shared with this network of people. These beliefs, also known as the imagined order in the words of Yuval Noah Harari, are crucial in structuring society and secure the most effective order, one that works like no other. We may take these abilities for granted or perhaps even overuse of them, but humans are no majestic creatures. We climbed up to the top of the food chain, not because we're the strongest or because we run the fastest, but because we cooperate. We are in a perpetual search for the most effective order, one bringing peace, happiness, stability. Hence, we are constantly changing it. This change advances humanity and is what we call history. However, to change thought you need influence, and culture is the most powerful influence one can have. Long ago, a tribe that had a different perspective on how the human race or the world should behave different to one's own were often viewed as barbarians, in other words, enemies. To every entity, the world was split into us and them, our tribe, their tribe. Let's take Tasmania, for example. For the Tasmanians, the world outside Tasmania was non-existent. Little did the Tasmanian society know that outside Tasmania lived the great Chinese emperor or the Egyptian pharaoh. All around the planet were scattered groups of humans, big or small, which were familiar with their own distinct environment and evolved differently because they had different factors contributing to the way they saw and explained the phenomena of our planet. And there, people, was born culture. And many years from then, cultures died out, cultures mixed, dominated, until we reach today. With technology today, the world is at our fingertips. This allows instantaneous access to information and communication, where isolated societies are rare. Masses of humans form this digital community where anyone everywhere around the world can share opinions, updates, and events through media and broadcasts. Just by owning a single platform like WhatsApp or Messages, one can communicate freely with whoever shares the same platform. This allows individuals to express themselves throughout the community. But these aren't the only social media platforms existing. Technology transcends borders, making communication accessible to more people regardless of time zone and environment. With the proliferation of devices, from portable smart devices to computers, people with completely contrasting opinions have the chance to connect and collaborate. The most important factor influencing culture today is this huge technological database which connects all humans. Otherwise, unique humans which evolved distinctly, resulting from centuries of cultural and ethical change. And what allows this interconnection is not only that, but the free movement of people as well. I have traveled abroad across the continents to study during the summers, and I'm glad to say that in all times, my experience with the people especially was remarkable. I was influenced by their culture and values, which taught me to see the world with other eyes. In response, I have made long-lasting friends whom I keep in touch to this day. Because of this connection, cultural trends spread with lightning speed, affecting the way we behave, live our lives and lifestyles, creating a mainstream culture. Again, don't worry. This change is only made throughout long periods of time. The current culture with the most influence is the one that originates the most media content, the one that was comprised of a melting pot of cultures to begin with, America. America, and by extension the West, are blamed mostly for their alleged imposition of culture worldwide. However, other developed countries in Asia, also reinforce Western culture globally. The only reason for this, in Professor of University of Pennsylvania's Martin McCrady's Globalization of Culture Through the Media, is that even most of the developed countries acquire entertainment from America and the West, and the information received is full of references to American and Western culture, which lures the rest of the world to incorporate American and Western elements into their own culture. The United States itself is comprised of immigrants from Europe and other developing countries, whose beliefs have been integrated into their mores as a whole. All this mingling is not an evil change being thrust upon society. It is healthy and enriching. It is an inevitable evolution and progression of how people interact given advanced capabilities to communicate. Cultural sharing is indeed a benefit because it potentially allows citizens from all over the world to enjoy aspects of each other's cultures. One culture does not need to be drastically changed for the worse in order to enjoy the rich diversity of another. It takes communities hundreds and hundreds of years to evolve their own morals, ethics, and business practices. Due to such historical means, integration into a monoculture would be illogical. As we look into the controversiality of these very different cultures, other important nations such as the Japanese and French have enough audience and are historically strong enough to survive on their own and maybe even influence the mainstream culture. Why is having an audience so important for the survival of a custom? If any culture reaches a critical mass, which means they have enough supporters, it will not die out. A simple analogy is to think of a nebula, like Crab Nebula, where this is easier to identify. If it has sufficient mass, the gas and dust particles will collapse under their own gravitational attraction to form a star, and so the star will remain in space. If there is not enough mass, however, the gas and dust particles will revolve around each other for a while, and as a nebula loses force, will be lost in space. If we think of these particles as individuals, cultures with not enough supporters will eventually cease to exist. Supporters of the most successful cultures all over the world can locate any information in the global database whenever and wherever. A great example of the interbreeding of cultures was when the Japanese happened to westernize several aspects of life, including the adoption of suits back in the 20th century. A more recent example is K-pop. A popular Western melody style is sung with Korean lyrics. And all of these examples justify the phenomena of Westernization. However, if we reflect on the nebula particle analogy, we can say that cultures with not enough supporters can die out eventually. History is more coincidental and not very deterministic, says Yuval. Just because a culture becomes popular in terms of how many supporters it has, does not mean it is the best choice made by humanity. Some cultures are not predestined to die out. They just do. For example, Aboriginal cultures remain smaller day by day despite specialist efforts to preserve them. According to the UIA Encyclopedia of Word Problems and Human Potential, 90 of Brazil's 270 indigenous tribes have been completely wiped out since the 20th century. While more than 2/3 of the remaining population have less than 1,000 people. Another matter to take into account is say how specific a culture may be. Earlier, I mentioned that the mainstream culture became the mainstream culture because it was more flexible and therefore most convincing for people to adapt to. Naturally, the mainstream culture changes itself to incorporate people's beliefs, making it agreeable to people. Other subcultures slowly incorporate more and more of the mainstream culture as it satisfies the whole population to embed a healthy interbreeding. This also means that the roots of these subcultures will be less like they were in the past. We have already seen how this works when the Texas came into the US after being an independent nation. According to Louise Gale of Washington University, some Texans might label themselves as such first, but many view themselves as an American before being a Texan. And that would be of Western dominance of cultural values and mainstream influence. According to National Geographic's Vanishing Voices, one language dies an average of 14 days. So within this trend, by the next century, half of the roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth are likely to abandon their native tongues in favor of Spanish, Mandarin, and English. The potential extinction of these languages poses a serious threat to smaller cultures which are now unable to articulate their beliefs. Is this phenomena of the world's culture shrinking and expanding at the same time the best road humanity could take? The assertion that it is possible for all cultures to become one is rather controversial. Perhaps if all cultures were not set up to contradict each other, a peaceful threshold could already be reached. The more realistic outcome would be that the mainstream culture influences other subcultures, but that they are not merged together. Opposing to the weaker cultures, those with the strongest historical background and enough audience will not lose their essence. The better representation of the cultural melting pot theory could again be seen as a mainstream culture pictured by the sun and the subcultures by the moons, planets, and satellites. This creates perfect balance, where this gravitational attraction is inevitable. In a utopian world where Japanese and its lovers all over the world can still eat sushi. And by the way, this is my favorite one. It's called ikura. It's really delicious. I love it. Thank you.